I just wanted to thank the conference organizers for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to speak here to all of you guys today. It's my first time in Paris. It's a beautiful city, and I hope to be back more. So let me introduce myself. My name is Yitzy Hammer. My partner Samuel and I, who you'll have the opportunity to hear from tomorrow, have a Web3 legal practice based out of Israel. We provide full-stack legal and regulatory coverage to companies and investors in the Web3 space. My background is in IP and commercial law, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about NFTs and intellectual property. So what is an NFT? I feel like the slide may be a little inappropriate for this audience, but for the sake of the presentation flow, I'll just say that at its core, an NFT, or a non-fungible token, is a blockchain-based unit of value with a unique ID linked to an underlying asset. They're non-fungible in the sense that each token is unique. Are they artworks? No, but the unique ID can link to an artwork or to another asset type. Okay, so if I own an NFT, what does that mean with respect to the underlying asset? Do I own that as well? Well, classic lawyer answer, it depends. Some rights are inherent, others need to be expressly assigned to the holder via a licensing agreement or some other variation of a legal contract between two parties. Let's just take a quick poll. How many people in the audience own an NFT? Okay. How many of you took the effort to look for the licensing terms before you bought your NFT? Even less. How many of you looked for the licensing terms and couldn't find them? Even less. Again, unsurprising. Unfortunately, the NFT space is heavily fraught with bad actors and lacking on the side of transparency and accountability. But it's not always the case of bad intentions. Many creators are just uninformed, which is unsurprising for an industry where the average creator age is guys in their early 20s. One client asked me to join him for a Zoom call with an NFT marketing expert. It was a 10-year-old kid, I shit you not. But that's the industry that we're in, for better or for worse. So let's get back to rights. There are generally two approaches that NFT creators take with respect to the communication or even the establishment of rights with respect to their works. So the first one is to be vague and fall back on default IP laws. In most cases, they're not falling back on anything. They just don't take the effort to draft terms or even think about it. But in that case, they would be falling back on default IP laws. And in what we've proven before is the lower spectrum, some projects take the time to be transparent and draft clear licensing terms. Like I said, it's not always a case of bad intentions. Many creators are just uninformed. But it's incredibly important for projects to take the time and effort to give thought to these issues and to draft clear licensing terms for their collections. It's equally important for people like you, the collectors, to seek out these terms before minting or buying and to inquire in a project's Discord. In addition to drafting terms and conditions, other measures can be taken to ensure transparency. For example, this is one project, Rebel Rabbits, where they put together this graphic that was distributed on their site, which said very clearly what rights you have in your NFT when you buy it. Actually bought one of their NFTs not because I thought it was going to go anywhere, but just because I liked the graphic and I was really proud of what they were doing. While these graphics are nice, more often than not, projects, like we said, don't have terms at all. And assuming there are no licensing terms, we talked before about falling back on default IP rights. So what are those? What are the default IP rights that I could fall back on as a holder? Well, we're about to learn that it's unfortunately not that easy. In other words, default IP rights might not be enough when it comes to NFTs, even if there are express licensing terms granting copyright. So I know we're in France right now, but you'll likely agree with me that when it comes to legal and regulatory compliance, a good practice is generally to look to the US and see what they're doing. So let's take a moment to see how the US Copyright Office views the copyright of computer-related works. So according to the Compendium of US Copyright Office Practices, the US Copyright Office will register an original work of authorship provided that the work was created by a human being. What does that even mean? Well, this position of the US Copyright Office is based on an 1879 landmark trademark case of the US Supreme Court, and it begs the following question. So if we're looking at NFTs and saying that they're copyrightable only if they're created by a human being, and oftentimes, especially with respect to NFTs, the computer takes a substantial role in the generation of the collection. How influential is a computer's role when creating a generative artwork? In other words, is a computer an assisting instrument in the process of making a generative artwork, or is the majority of the work performed by a computer? So, Dave Steiner is an artist and a lawyer who specializes in IP law, and he believes very strongly that generative art NFTs are not protected by copyright for the following reasons. Number one, NFTs in general, and generative collections in particular, lack a minimum amount of creative authorship to qualify for copyright protection. Okay, let's just think about that for a second. Typically, the way that generative art collections are created is you have some main artworks, like if we're talking about a character, so it's the main character, and then the same artist or multiple other artists will draw all different kind of items and elements, and then they'll throw them all together, and using AI and a smart contract, they'll mish them up, and they'll mint them as a collection of varying combinations of backgrounds and the main character with different items. So what Steiner is saying, first of all, is that these collections, the way they're composed and the output, there aren't enough compositions that each one would be unique enough to be able to be protected from a copyright perspective. His second point is that it wasn't created by a human author, but rather assembled by code, which we touched on earlier. And his third point, which is actually the one that I want to focus on, is he says with respect to generative art collections, there are too few ways to express the same idea in a work. So this connects a little bit with the first point. But in other words, what he's saying is that the second original work that comes out would almost definitely have been created based on the earlier work. And we'll see what he means in 1 second. Okay, so I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Bored Ape Yacht Club collection of Yuga Labs. And these are two actual apes. The first one, Bored Ape 6578, and the second, 7065, are each their own apes and are owned by different people. And supposedly, according to the terms, each of those holders has express commercial rights and other copyright with respect to those, with respect to their NFT. According to Steiner, 6578, which came out first, would be the only one that would be protected from a copyright perspective. The second one, 7065, which is basically the same thing without the earring, would be infringing on the first. Okay, so not only is it possible that these works may not be copyrightable, one of them may even be infringing on the other. Now, these are real issues which haven't been addressed in the courts or in the legislature, and they may significantly impact the rights we think we have to certain NFTs in our collection, if not all of them. Some projects, like Crypto Skulls, are getting creative and are trying to circumvent this little loophole. So these are Crypto Skulls terms, and you'll note in the third paragraph, if you could read it. If you can, I'll just quickly read it for you. Recognizing this issue, they say, it is our opinion that blockchain transactions satisfies the legal requirement for copyright transfer. So copyright ownership of each individual image is adjudicated by the Ethereum or Polygon address for which the NFT of that image is assigned, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so they're basically saying we recognize that there's an issue here and we want to expressly assign to you the copyright in these NFTs, but just doing that may not be enough. if what Steiner, who we mentioned before, is alleging is correct, the creators who are supposedly or trying, creators like CryptoSkulls who are trying to assign these rights in their terms and conditions may not even have these rights to begin with to be able to give them to the NFT holders, and that's precisely why this is a major issue. So we talked about Steiner, and then there's another legal academic in the field who's very vocal on this issue, and I want to just focus on his perspective for just one moment, even though it goes very closely with what Steiner is saying. He's takes a slightly different approach. His name is Professor Philip Fry, and rather than focusing on the generative element of the artwork, like Steiner, Fry takes a deeper look at the NFT's genetic coding, in other words, its code. According to Fry, the copyrightability of NFTs is questionable, given that NFTs in their purest sense are not art, they're just a tiny bit of encrypted data written onto a blockchain. How could you infringe that? And the Uniform Resource Identifier, the URI for each project, is completely different and therefore stored on a different string of code, which should be able to stand as its own unique piece of work. So according to Fry and Steiner, so long as the URI is not the same, the artwork is not infringing. Or rather, it's not protectable by copyright and not infringing. You can't copy an NFT. So weighing heavily on these two scholars, but on Steiner in particular, Ryder Ripps, who you may have heard his name on Twitter or in the news, enters the scene. So who's Ryder Ripps? Ripps is a contemporary artist who launched a campaign to remint Bored Apes, redistributing them under the collection name RR Bake. He made a lot of noise on social media, loudly proclaiming that you can't copy an NFT, and there's zero chance that Yuga Labs, the creators of the Bored Ape Yacht Club collection, will ever sue him. Literally, he tweeted, "There is zero chance that Yuga Labs will ever sue me." But they did. But more on that in a moment. So what are Rip's viewpoint on the ability to copyright NFTs, right? Like I said, he's very vocal, and he has several projects, but one particularly focused at the Bored Ape Yacht Club collection, where he outright remints the exact same NFT. So, like I said, he weighs heavily on both Steiner and Fry, ultimately echoing them and stating that he is not infringing because he's appending, and these are his words, appending a different non-fungible blockchain signature to his project, and that his work is actually a new expression that would subject it to the fair use doctrine, which is one of the exceptions from copyright protection under US law. Secondly, he says with respect to the images themselves, he could use them for several reasons, the chief one among them being that he's using a completely different URI, like we explained before. In any event, after much prodding by Ripps on social media and otherwise, Yuga Labs eventually filed suit a few weeks ago. But the interesting thing here is that in the suit filed against Ripps, there's no mention of copyright infringement at all. So we've been talking about this big issue of the fact that NFTs are not copyrightable, and how Ripps is making his main argument on the fact that you can't copy an NFT, and then finally Yuga Labs comes and they sue him, but there's no mention of copyright infringement. So what's the deal there? So there are several reasons why Yuga Labs may not have mentioned copyright in their complaint. Their complaint is focused solely on trademark infringement. They say that he infringed the trademarks or pending trademarks for the word ape, the term BAYC, bake, other various trademarks, and there's no mention of copyright at all. So I'm not a representative of Yuga Labs, but I would argue that there are probably two reasons why they may not have mentioned copyright. The first being that in their terms and conditions, and this is kind of one of the things that made the Bored Apes big to begin with, is they got really creative with IP rights, and they took it a step further, and they said we're going to assign commercial use rights to in our NFTs to our holders. And their terms and conditions clearly state when you purchase an NFT, you own the underlying Bored Ape and the art completely. So perhaps having assigned all of these rights, which they may or may not have had to begin with based on Steiner and Fry's approach, they actually gave the rights to sue for the infringement to the holders of those NFTs. So if you had one of the NFTs that were reminted by Ryder Ripps, maybe you as the holder potentially had the rights to go and sue the person who is allegedly infringing, but Yuga Labs didn't. That's one argument. The other one, and this is what I feel very strongly is probably the reason why they didn't mention this in their suit, is that nobody knows whether or not NFTs are copyrightable or not, and they didn't want this to be something that's brought up in court. Ryder Ripps certainly did. This is why I think he was pushing them to sue him so hardly, because he wants this to be settled. But in any event, they didn't mention it, and it's sort of this huge big bubble and big question mark over the NFT community at large and the various NFT communities of like, what, if you're a collector, what rights do I actually have? Well, I don't know, you don't know, the creators don't know, the collectors don't know. The courts and the legislature need to address these issues. Our practice is a practice that's focused on the regulatory and legal side of the Web3 space, and one of the things that we advocate strongly for is regulation. People want to operate within clear confines, clear guidelines. They don't want to be in a vacuum all the time, not knowing, can I do this, can I not do this? And it's the same really with anything. You invest heavily in something, you buy or sell it, and you think you have something. Well, do you or do you not? So we live in a world where we need people to tell us what to do. So I beg the courts and governments to make laws and make court cases and give us a little bit more clarity on where these kind of things are going. So thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure being here, and I think we have like 3 minutes for questions if anybody has any. No time? Okay, one question. All right, thank you very much.